Welcome to Roadmaps and Roadblocks. I'm Beth Osborne, former Director of Transportation for America, and now Interim President and CEO of Smart Growth America, which is the parent organization for Transportation for America.
And I'm Martha Roskowski, working with the Funders Network. So we created this series to provide bite-size, kind of maybe big gulp size information and stories about the federal program that supports highway, transit, passenger rail, active transportation got to be the way it is and how we can make it better. So this series is for anyone who thinks we deserve a better, safer transportation system that gets people where they need to go. The series is designed to help you understand what's worked, what hasn't, and what you can do going forward.
So let's get to our special guest. Today, we're going to talk to Rebecca Higgins, a bona fide policy expert. I know because I've gotten to work with her and I've gotten to see her in action. She currently serves as the Vice President of Policy for Eno Center for Transportation. She was also the Senior Policy Advisor to the Senate Committee on the Environment and Public Works for nearly 7 years. And previously, she was a legislative assistant to Senator Tom Carper, taking a role I played several years before. And she worked with me at USDOT as a senior policy analyst. So she has seen the federal transportation legislative process and the implementation of the program from a number of angles. And I know she has some thoughts.
And I think we met when I worked for People for Bikes and we were doing the Green Lane project and we were trying to get protected bike lanes into the design manuals.
That's right.
So everybody could build them. So yeah, it's a small world we work in here.
It is.
Before we get to our 4 questions, tell us just as a little bit of background, like how you got into transportation.
I actually came to DC to do a policy master's degree, thinking that I would work on labor policy with a focus on women in the workforce. And then I decided I didn't want to fight a culture war every day and realized that infrastructure and transportation solutions specifically was more clear cut. And I loved the way that that transportation shapes, physically shapes people's communities and their experience of their social communities. I love, being on the bus and seeing people I know and meeting people I don't know, and the way that it creates spaces in which our society can thrive. I think that there are ways that transportation can be fundamentally pro-social, and also ways that it can not be pro-social. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about how transportation choices can build a stronger community.
We're going to focus on the kind of the whole reauthorization process. So first question, what about this process is working?
Well, I think part of the question has to be working for whom. I do think that it's working fairly well for state DOTs. I mean, obviously there continue to be some challenges that states face, and things that could be made easier, but I would say Senate staff work very closely with their state DOTs. The senators are statewide elected official and typically have good relationships with their governors and with the state DOT staff, and hear regularly from them about where there are concerns. And
a bunch of them were governors too.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Right. And I think that really is part of the motivation for prioritizing passage of a long-term bill as regularly as is possible. Obviously, it hasn't been passed on time for in modern transportation history, but it's like decently close. I mean, I think in that regard it is working. We have funding. The funding has pretty steadily increased. It was pretty flat for MAP 21, but outside of that, it's been it fairly steady, and then a much steeper increase in IIJA, and I think that the programs, while remaining fairly consistent, I think that there's a lot of interest and preference for consistent programs, but we have also responded to new needs through the creation of new programs. So for instance, there was recognition of the need for like a multimodal freight program, a formula program focused on freight. And so in FAST Act, there was a freight focus. We had freight advisory committee created and a freight formula program and a discretionary freight program. And there were multimodal elements within capped, but within both of those programs. In IIJA, I think one of the spaces that we felt most strongly was a gap was climate change. And so we had the first ever climate title. We had both resilience programs and electrification, low emission transportation programs.
Well, that you're leading the way into the second question, which is what is something that's not working in the federal reauthorization process?
I think that one thing that we don't do enough of is a look back at how effective and successful our programs have been. And we do make changes to federal programs, but and sometimes those are in response to GAO audits or other kind of external sources of research. Eno, and I'm now at Eno, and we're certainly looking at opportunities to look back at the success of programs and point the way toward what might be needed for the future. But I don't think there's a consistent way in which that's accomplished. And so for instance, MAP 21, I think that the process, as I understand it, they really did look at the programs that had come before. There was a sense that there were too many programs. They were highly specialized. There was a need for more flexibility. There was a need for more accountability. And so they combined a number of programs. They created performance measures. They created asset management requirements. And I don't know that there's been sufficient work to look back at that and say, this had the effect that we intended it to have, or it didn't have the effect that we intended it to have. And as a result, we should change it in the following ways. And I think that is difficult to do because of the structure of the federal programs. They're federally the federally funded but state administered programs for the most part. And so as the states administer those programs, there are different ways in which states operate, and it can be difficult to have consistent feedback. And there's also just I don't know, maybe, is it laziness of congressional staff? I'm not sure. I think, but I don't think that there's enough of that happening, and that would be a real improvement if we could have an expectation of a look back at what we funded, how it's performed, and what needs to change.
Well, Rebecca, I'm interested in digging into that last comment because I think there's a lot there. And in my experience, when I was on Capitol Hill, both in the House and the Senate, nobody handled transportation. And that was one of the biggest problems. When I was working for Carper during MAP 21, the lead up to MAP 21 early, but Safety Lou is where I worked with him. I would pull together the so-called transportation staffers, and I discovered that most of them weren't the transportation staffer. I mean, they were, but they were really the housing staffer that got stuck with the transportation if they drew the short straw and transportation happened to come up that Congress.
Yeah, I think that Senate and House offices reflect their boss's priorities, and so one piece is just like there aren't that many senators and House members who are focused on transportation as a major issue area, and so therefore they're and then of course every personal office staff has a wide portfolio. I mean, when I was already a transportation expert when I started in the Carper office, and I was there kind of knowing he would go to EPW, but in the meantime, those 9 months that I spent in his office, I had a portfolio that included transportation apparently includes aviation, which at the time I knew nothing about. So aviation policy, labor policy, pensions policy, which is like a very complicated field, toxics, and we were in the midst of conferencing the Lautenberg Toxic Substances Control Act, so I had to get up to speed on that for really quickly. And I think that you're right that the fact that it's a 5-year cycle means that it's not easy for it to be the main thing, unlike, defense, which is going to come up much more regularly, or appropriations. So I think that that's an element of it, but I do also think that there is a question of member interest. But that's it. I think it's actually valuable to have the congressional staff who have both housing in their portfolio and energy systems, and so they're able to understand the way that these systems interact and the environmental effects of. I think that there is a much more kind of global and comprehensive understanding as a result of those portfolios that cross multiple, agency lines. And so there's some upside of that as well.
I mean, being at Smart Growth America, I certainly endorse that. Looking at the entirety of the built environment is super duper important. But I just experienced myself that those issues that I had to work on every year, I layered my understanding, and those were the places I could really make my mark. And same thing with my boss. And it was harder to build something up as an area of expertise, or the area you were going to make your mark, if it might come up in 7 years, so.
Well, I sat down at one point with the SASC staffers who lead NDAA. It was like, I think what we need to do for transportation is to make it an annual bill so that like everyone stays engaged. And I had a whole strategy. Oh, he was fine with it. I mean, he was like, good luck. But yeah, here's like the pros and cons. But I do think that the challenge is that the agencies that are ultimately receiving these funds and planning and programming the dollars, and they need some long-term certainty. So I think what you'd have to do is make it an annual bill for, like in 2025 now, we'd be working on the 2029 bill or something like that, so that they would know what's coming. There'd be an opportunity to change things, but they would have, maybe 2 years or some number of years ahead, so that there's not kind of a sudden and jarring shift in priorities that they can't plan for, because there's a long lead up to before the dollars get programmed.
Why don't you spend a little more time on this idea that if we were going to do it right in 2029, what would we be doing now? I mean, we have a reauthorization coming up now, but if the next one was going to be done differently, like what would that look like? What would folks on the outside in the foundation world, in the advocacy world, our friends across the country, how would those conversations be queued up?
My experience working on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there were a number of ways that it was challenging. It was kind of, we were coming out of COVID, and so meetings were virtual, and there was but one thing that I noticed was there wasn't a lot of transportation vocabulary within the kind of environmental NGOs as much as would be helpful. And it's I think one thing to be aware of is you never get a blank slate. There will, the statute will continue. It's not going to be repealed. It will always be there. And so working within the context in which we exist is critically important, and having solutions that fit within that structure, or can, offer specific ways to change that structure in ways that are more, that will advance the priorities of that group. So, I think that the bicycle advocates were very effective in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act lead up, because they had a specific bill. They had members leading that bill on the Republican and Democratic side of the aisle, and it was not a wholesale rescission of previous programs and creation of new programs. It was, here are the ways that we are taking this program and modifying it in concrete, specific ways to advance our goals and make the programs work better. There were advocacy groups that were much more kind of vague in there, and with goals that I strongly agreed with on reducing emissions, and you know, better integrating land use, but without a lot of very specific ideas on like how to do that. What are the specific changes, and what is the kind of case to be made within the Senate for advancing that? And I think that we were less successful as a result. And there were multiple reasons for that. But I think the more that we can work the existing system and modify that system to be to achieve the goals that we have, I think the more successful we'll be. I do think that the other challenge is that there are parts of the statute that are better than the real world outcomes. So for instance, in planning, you know, the statute says pretty clearly that MPOs write their transportation improvement program, that gets adopted by the states and is used to determine programming, right? Like that's what it says in the statute. And so part of the challenge here is recognizing that there can be this sort of drift, this distance between the word of the law and the outcomes on the ground, and educating the Senate staff and congressional staff about that, and figuring out how to use reauthorization to make culture change is very difficult. But it's important, and that it is possible, you know, to reinforce language that technically is already in the law, but might not be, you know, there might be variation in the way that it's being implemented to better or worse outcomes.
It's a great example. And just to kind of pull those two examples you brought up together, you know, one of the questions I try to ask is, you know, what is a win in reauthorization? How would they bring a proposal to reauthorization to this process that is built around a very structured program, and just like you said, a federally funded state-run system, to get a better outcome rather than a program that is often a salve but not a change?
I think that one thing to be aware of that you already know, Beth, but for folks who haven't worked on the Hill, there are many offices for whom the principal, the elected official, their view will be, with regard to reauthorization of our infrastructure programs, a win is a win is a win. Like they're just reauthorizing them is the win.
Is the win.
That is the win. And like having some awareness that there are important policies that are not being achieved in our current programs is not guaranteed. You know, that's not something that every elected official will see and recognize. It's very difficult in our current programs because of the flexibility that already exists in the programs. Both within the programs, many of them have very wide-ranging eligibilities, and then also the fact that program dollars can be flexed from program to program, like even further increases that flexibility. So if you have a narrow specific goal, and you you're throwing it into a mix, like it's a big hopper of other program goals, and that eligibility doesn't mean that will be a priority for the agency that's implementing that program, which at the end of the day is a state or local entity, and they have their and there are reasons to have flexibility. We have very different transportation needs across our nation. So I'm not condoning, like, I'm not saying there should be no flexibility, but in terms of the goal, you know, the premise of your question, like if you have this one specific goal, adding flexibility in the form of a new eligibility does
It only
not
goes
really
so far.
achieve that goal.
But it might come back to your original point, which is we need to look back at past bills and see what was achieved so that
Yeah.
members of Congress go beyond just get it done. I think your answer is just kind of neatly tied back together.
Yeah, it seems like either, I know there's always a desire to make the federal programs more prescriptive, more,
Mhm.
tell the states what to do. There's also a desire to keep the decision making more local. So I do think the move to move more money to the regional level, the MPO level, the city level is also, I think that could be helpful in building a more sustainable, equitable system with more transportation options. So it feels like there's sort of these bookends of work that's going on.
There's a philosophical question about what the federal role in
Yes, there is.
transportation is and what the federal transportation programs are intended to accomplish. And I think that, the origin of our federal transportation programs was interstate highways because we have interstate commerce, and so having a network of interstate highways was to the benefit of the public, and also there was a clear federal role in designating and funding them, and they are designated, they are built, and our needs now may look a lot different than they
Yeah,
did in
the 1950s.
1956. And but and obviously we have changed our federal program significantly, and now fund transit, which we didn't initially, and there is a recognized federal interest in enabling mobility within urban areas, which are major drivers of GDP. But I don't know. I think that there was sort of a partial change in our, in the intent of our programs, and
Totally.
it has not by any means like achieved a new consensus on the intent of the programs and the role of the federal government. And and I think that there sometimes I do wonder whether like there could be some benefits of having a slightly devolved program, like a small, we've increased federal spending tremendously. And maybe instead of increasing federal funding and sending more of it back to localities, there could just be more local role in transportation. I don't know. I have mixed feelings on what the right approach is, or not mixed feelings, but I have uncertainty. But
I have mixed feelings on it. I do. And if you look at other countries, they have much smaller federal programs and they don't have trust funds, but they have better results. That's a
Mhm.
provocative thought. Maybe we're going about it totally the wrong way and we need the feds to get out of it. I don't know, but it does seem like a moment to at least start to have to have those provocative conversations.
Right.
So
I mean, the trust fund has
long past broken.
been on the brink of yeah, dissolution for a long time,
Yeah.
and it was shocking to see how, especially after the FAST Act, where, Tom Carper voted no for the FAST Act because of the huge transfer
Funding.
from the general fund. And it was a major, major question. And they created the state pilots on VMT because they recognized we need to come up with a solution on this. And then in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, no one
Everyone was
even
fine with
mentioned
it.
it. I was on the floor the whole time. It wasn't even a point of discussion.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I part of that I think is because we were in this moment of COVID when there was this need to support the country and to provide more funding to get us through. And I think we did that successfully, right? We did get through that pretty difficult time without a huge hit to our economy. But it I don't think that the discussion should just go away. I think we need to have a real conversation about where the funding comes from. What does it mean to transfer funding into a trust fund and then provide it to state and local agencies when it wasn't actually user fee generated as trust funds are supposed to be.
Rebecca, that is a great place to end. Where can people find your good work?
Eno has a website, which I encourage you all to visit. It's enotrans.org. And we post all of our research and Eno Transportation Weekly articles there.
Perfect.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Like lots
Pleasure to be here.
About and talk about.
Yes, this was a lot of fun.
Till next time. Good luck with your interview series.
Thanks, Rebecca.
That was fun.
That was fun.
Super smart. Lots of things to think about. And I think collectively, if we could have that big conversation in our community, it would be really, really exciting. And the time's right to start it now.
No, I agree. She asked a lot of interesting questions at the end, and we should be pushing members of Congress to ask those questions as well.
Yep.
And I have a fun little fact about the Eno Center for Transportation. Eno was named after William Phelps Eno, who was born back in the 1850s in New York City. He was an American businessman responsible for many of the road safety and traffic control mechanisms we rely on today, including the stop sign, the pedestrian crosswalk, the taxi stand, and pedestrian safety islands. And he helped to popularize things that were already in existence, like the traffic circle and one-way streets. But interestingly, he never learned to drive a car himself.
Whew. Okay. So the wheels of transportation keep rolling, and so do we. Catch you next time.